This is an interview with Ellen Spertus from Mills College and Google, conducted by Vicki Almstrum. This interview is being recorded on October 23, 2008 in Mountain View, California. It is part of the Computing Educators Oral History Project. Did we give and pronounce your name correctly?
Yes.
Good. I'm so pleased to get together with you here this morning, Ellen, and I'd like to start in the far distant past. Let's begin by talking about your parents. Can you tell me a little bit about their education, their work life, and so forth?
Sure. My father went to MIT. He graduated in 1956. His major was business with engineering, and he was basically pre-DB, pre-Daddy's business. The family business was picture frame manufacturing. The company was Intercraft. It was founded by my grandfather and his brother after they came over from Russia. They lived the American dream. They came over, started by working in factories, learning English at night school, and ended up owning factories and becoming philanthropists. And my father became president of the company, and I certainly wasn't diminishing his contribution by saying going into the family business. It grew a lot under him. It became a Fortune 1000 company. The business has been sold. He was a businessman, but he loved computers, and he discovered them after he graduated from MIT and regretted never being involved with computers when he was there. And even though he was an executive, he'd bring terminals home and he'd write programs in the evening. And I got started on programming from him. When I was admitted to MIT and decided to study computer science, he was, he called it one of the happiest days of his life. My mother was a housewife. She got a bachelor's degree from University of Iowa, I think in geography, when she was graduating in 1957, and she became a school teacher in Iowa, and she hated it. She, I don't think, was interested in having a career. She was going to get married, and didn't like teaching, especially somewhere so rural where there weren't any other Jews. And she left there, moved to Chicago, I think did some graduate work, and she met my father, and they were married, and she never worked outside of the house after that. Well, that's not true. Much later she did some work in real estate, but while I was growing up, she didn't work outside of the home.
And so where was it that you grew up?
I grew up in Glencoe, Illinois, which is a north suburb of Chicago. So it's a upper middle class suburb, a nice place to grow up, very good schools.
And that's where your father had come from and
Right.
started his business, or the family business had started there?
Yeah, the business was located in Chicago, but my father also grew up on the North Shore of Chicago. My mother grew up in Rock Island, Illinois, which was near Moline and Davenport on the Illinois-Iowa boundary, and she was happy to get out of there and to live in a more cultured place and to have married up in terms of wealth and status.
Okay. And so can you tell us a little bit about the community you grew up in and the schools you went through to in pre-college?
Sure. As I said, I grew up in Glencoe, and that was a prosperous suburb of about 10,000 people, and maybe half Jewish. My family's Jewish, and we grew up in a large house near the beach, near the train station. My father commuted into the city, and I went to public school through 6th grade, And I don't remember this, but my mother said that in 6th grade I went to the principal and said that I wasn't learning anything, that I knew all that they were teaching, and that he couldn't disagree with that. But what I remember is the reason that I left the public school was social. I was very unpopular. I remember as early as kindergarten, everyone being invited to a party, birthday party, except for me and the retarded boy. And starting in 7th grade, I spent 7th and 8th grade at a private school, North Shore Country Day School in Winnetka, and that was academically better. I could work ahead in math. In 7th grade, I started taking algebra with the 8th graders, but that was so easy for me that I switched up to more advanced math in the high school, which also didn't endear me with people. The 8th grader, who was worse to me, named Lorna Nellis, and years later, my sister Debbie married her brother, so she became my sister's sister-in-law. And I found out that her brother, my brother-in-law, had skipped ahead in math and was beaten up for it by the boys. So I guess as a girl, I was better off because there wasn't physical violence, but it's kind of funny that she disliked me for doing the same thing her brother did. And by 8th grade, I was having some social problems again. And in 9th grade, I switched back to public for high school. I went to one of the top public high schools in the country, New Trier High School in Winnetka. And it was an excellent school with a level system where there were second, third, most classes were offered the second, third, and fourth level. So fourth level would be honors. So I took all my classes were 4-level classes until I got to AP, which was 5-level. And there were complicated formulas for how an A in one compared to a B in another for computing GPA. So I was basically with the top students, and the teachers were excellent. The material was challenging, and I was active with math club. Back then we usually won the state math meet. Now, after I went through Illinois, started a special school, I think an overnight magnet school for the sciences, and that might have been a good place for me. But New Trier was pretty good too, and I got a good education there and made friends with people through math club and bridge club, and also those were boys, and also with girls through homeroom and some of my other classes.
So this, this was sort of the first time you had a real cohort, is what it sounds like, that when you reached that point, there was a better social network that you were able to become part of?
Yeah. And I think there were about 1,000 students in my year. It was a big school, though I think it felt smaller because I was just with the top students. And I was something like 22nd in the class, so I wasn't the top student. There were ones who got better grades than I did. I still got very good grades, but I had the occasional B. And I'm the third child in my family. My big brother, Michael, who's 6.5 years older than me, was a math star and well known locally for that. My big sister Debbie was a year younger than him and wasn't distinguished academically, which was hard for her because she was known as Mike's sister. but it worked to my advantage because teachers who knew him expected a lot from me. And in one case, I don't know if it was a substitute teacher, a regular teacher, gave me harder math work just knowing my brother. And so I never encountered the idea that I shouldn't be good at math because I was a girl. Instead, I should be good at math because I'm a Spertus. And my family does have a kind of high opinion of itself, high expectations. I mentioned about the family patriarchs, and back in Russia there were quotas against Jews to get into college, but my grandfather and his brother got in anyway. The idea is you're just really good.
Interesting. And so those two had emigrated, is that right? Yes. So they had finished school and were adults when they came to the United States.
Right, they emigrated. They had left the country illegally when they were in their early 20s, avoid the army.
Makes sense.
Join their parents and their sisters who'd already immigrated to the United States.
Okay. So, which courses while you were in pre-college and high school were your favorites?
I liked the math classes. I found geometry hard. I found that some people are good at algebra but find geometry hard, and some people are the other way around. So algebra, as I told you, I basically skipped algebra because it was all so easy. My mother hired a tutor to fill me in on the things in algebra, but so geometry was hard, although I wouldn't say I disliked it. We had some very good English courses. I also enjoy reading good literature and discussing it and thinking about it. Math courses, science courses. I didn't like biology, but I liked chemistry and physics and AP physics. I kind of liked French and was good at it. I had teachers of varying quality. I'd say the only thing I really disliked was PE. And I could take some elective classes, and some that I particularly remember having enjoyed were photography and filmmaking. I did not take any computer classes. I was self-taught on computers. My brother and father would get me started, but I didn't take computer classes, and I don't think there was a computer club. I did teach some boys to program. This would be in like 5th and 6th grade. I had them over and taught them how to program.
So what language was that?
That would have been BASIC. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was just BASIC. From the time period, it could have been Pascal also, but I think BASIC. And when I was in high school, I did some tutoring of children in math and programming. So in high school, I tutored some children in math and computers. I remember teaching Logo to a little boy, and he was like 6 or 7, and he'd say something like forward 10, and I'd walk forward or turn right. I think it's a kick for a kid to have a grown-up, a teenager, following his instructions, and of course doing it on the computer, and teaching BASIC to his older brother, who I think had tried doing a little on his own. How kids, or sometimes grown-ups, don't know how to pronounce things that they read, so he referred to a syntax error for a syntax error. There's one other place I had a cohort. I went to computer camp the summers when I was, I think, 12 and 13. It was pretty new then, but there were other kids who liked to program, and I was in the top group there, but I certainly had peers.
Very good. And so you've talked about being in a lot of different clubs through the school.
Well, just math club and bridge club.
Okay. And those were a key part of your social network. Were there any other outside activities that you became a part of?
I had some jobs. I worked at the library in junior high school, and I babysat in high school. And I did some volunteer work in high school, but I don't think those were big things.
Did you have any teachers who were particularly, or counselors or other people during your pre-college years that were particularly influential in the direction you ended up going?
I don't think so. I think it was pretty clear from an early age that I was going in math and computers. I did go to a math summer program, a well-known one, the one at Ohio State in number theory, run by Professor Arnold Ross, who I think is no longer with us, I'm not sure. And until then, I didn't know if I wanted to be a mathematician or computer scientist. And after that program, I decided I didn't want to be a mathematician, that was too much math for me. It was math all day and all night, and I wasn't quite that into it, but for computers, sure, that would have been fine. But I did get a good background in math and know how to do a rigorous proof, knew how to before college.
You've talked a little bit about your siblings. So Michael and Debbie are the two older ones.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little more about the rest of them? You have some younger ones as well?
One younger sister.
Okay.
Right. So my brother Michael took after my father, and my sister Debbie took after my mother and was groomed to be a housewife. And my little sister Andrea, who was 3 years younger than me, wasn't that clear. I think younger children sometimes have a little more freedom, and she's been doing web design for a number of years. My big sister is an artist. It's a skill that my parents didn't really appreciate, and I'd say my younger sister is more in between, that she has both aesthetics and technical ability, neither as intensely as the rest of us, but maybe more balanced intellectually.
So you've talked a lot about the attitude your parents had toward education, that it was sort of a given. So I'd be curious to hear just a little more about that, and also your feeling about whether you had the same opportunities, the same educational training, had sort of the same aspirations across your array of siblings.
Right. Well, education was greatly valued. It's a strong Jewish value that my parents shared, and certainly they had the highest respect for professors, even though they don't earn a lot of money. That's something that's valued. And there were certainly the same educational expectations for me as for my brother. I think there may have been less for my big sister, who was expected not to need a career and wasn't as intellectual. But even she got a master's degree. But as I said, my father was delighted when I went to MIT. I think my mother didn't know quite what to make of an engineer daughter. And when I came home from MIT freshman year with the freshman picture book that had pictures of all the students and their names, my mom looked through it and she said, "Oh, some of these girls are pretty." So she didn't expect that for women from an engineering school. So I think she was more of the don't show boys you're too smart or they might not like you school. But of course, worrying that your computer scientist daughter won't be able to find a husband is about the stupidest worry you could have with the male-female ratio in that field. And I never had problems finding boyfriends, from the math and computer community.
Interesting. So what I'd like to do now is shift to...
I'll add one more thing. I grew up with my brother being the intellectual giant of the household, and I was second to him. But I'm the only one of the four to complete a PhD. My brother's ABD in math, and my sisters have master's degrees, which are also known as Jewish dropouts. So my brother's very successful, but he also really respects me for completing the PhD.
Very cool. So it sounds like there may have been friendly competition and definitely some support among you.
Well, there wasn't competition. It was just so clear my brother was the stronger one. So it was, it's surprising how it turned out that I'm the one who got further academically.
Yeah. So the transition I was getting ready to make now is starting to think about your decision to go to MIT and beginning to do your studies. You've started a little bit on some of those aspects. So how did you decide?
Well, my brother gave me a lot of the culture of, I'd say, hacker culture, and would tell me about MIT hacks, the pranks that the students did. I remember he also told me about Seymour Cray and the things he did. So I'd been exposed to the mystique of MIT, and of course I knew it's where my father went. I visited a number of schools when I was a senior. This would be, I think I'd already applied to schools. I applied to Yale, MIT, Stanford, maybe University of Chicago, which is where my brother went. Berkeley and Illinois were my safety schools. Maybe there was one more. And I went and visited schools with my dad. And when I visited Yale, I went around and took notes on how many books were in the library and stuff like that. But when I went to MIT, it was just clear that's where I belonged, that people there looked like my type of people, that it was where I'd fit in. We sat in on classes, and I sat in on one taught by Jerry Sussman, famous computer science educator, deservedly well known, his scheme course. But it was just clear that MIT was the place for me. And when we met with the admissions office, it was just before they were going to send out the early admission notifications, and they made an exception in our case and told me that I'd gotten in, and I was delighted. And as I said, my father called it one of the happiest days of his life. So I was the first person admitted to the class of 1990. And I canceled my upcoming visit to Tufts and withdrew all of my applications except the one to Stanford, and that was more just being curious if I'd get in. I was waitlisted at Stanford and told them to drop me from the wait list. With the MIT early notification, you don't need to decide until the regular time, but I think I'd pretty much decided.
So you got to pack things up and move from Chicago to Boston, and so tell us about getting started.
Well, I knew I wanted to major in computer science and started taking computer science my first semester, the MIT SCHEME course. There's some professors who'd advise you not to take that right away, but I did, and I loved it, and I did well in it. Something like the majority of, I don't know if it's the majority, but a large percentage of MIT students were valedictorians. And as I told you, I wasn't. And I've heard, this is probably apocryphal, that they surveyed MIT students and asked if they expected to be in the top half of their class, and 98% said they did. And I thought I'd be about average at MIT, and instead I was one of the top students. Freshman year was past no record to help people get used to a more challenging environment, but I did fine freshman year taking computer science and calculus and physics and those other classes, but I really enjoyed the computer science courses. The required EE courses, not so much. And yeah, just was a computer science major, no switching majors or doubts about that.
So you had a pretty straight trajectory.
Yes.
Knowing that that was the direction you were going.
Right.
So you took the SCHEME class and continued with computer science classes. Which ones were the ones that resonated best with you during your undergraduate years?
The SCHEME course, 6001, Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. Then Steve Ward's Computer Architecture class, 6004. I'd been programming computers for a long time by then, including assembly language, but I didn't know what happened below that. And in 6004, we built a computer, digital electronics, AND gates, OR gates, ALUs, and I got to understand all the way down how computers worked, and that was very exciting. And the other class that stood out was compilers, which I took from Barbara Liskoff and John Guttag. And I did most of my programming in high-level languages, so to learn how got translated into machine language. So between that and the architecture class, I knew how things worked all the way from C or whatever programming language you use down to the hardware. So those were the most exciting.
Okay. And you did some research as an undergraduate. You did a thesis. It was compiling data flow programs to the MIT J machine. And you also had a publication that is well known, a term paper that you expanded to a technical report, Why Are There So Few Women in Computer Science? Two interesting contrasts. I'd be interested to hear about the research, about the paper on women, and sort of how that fit with your time as an undergraduate.
Okay. Yeah, well, I started doing computer science research through the URA, Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program. As a junior, I joined Bill Daly's computer architecture group. Architecture and compilers were interesting to me. When I was in junior high school, I tried writing a compiler because I knew assembly language and I knew BASIC, but I didn't get very far. Joining this computer architecture group was great. The team was building a massively parallel computer, which had its own processor and instruction set. And the project Bill Daly gave me was to write a compiler so programs written in the data flow model could run on the J machine. Part of his research idea was that he was building a general purpose parallel computer that many different parallel paradigms could be implemented on. And even though I was an undergraduate, he met with me regularly. Certainly, everyone treated me very well. At MIT, I never had someone, my advisor, Arvind, never discouraged me from taking challenging classes. In fact, he suggested I try to place out of a certain class, and Bill Daly's expectations were always high for me. So I did that work. I don't remember now whether it was for pay or credit. Thanks to my family, I didn't have to worry about money going through school. And we're required to do a bachelor's thesis at MIT. I would have wanted to anyway. So I did my bachelor's thesis on data flow computing on the J machine and enjoyed that and presented the work at a second-tier conference, but it was still cool to get my first publication. I think it was a short paper at ICPP, International Conference on Parallel Processing, Parallel Programming. Then that moves on to graduate school because I stayed in that group. Now, as for the other work, we were required to take 8 humanities courses in order to graduate, and we all complained about that. That students at other colleges didn't have to take 8 technical courses to graduate. And we said humanities for humanities, arts, social sciences. So basically you had to take one of these a semester, and it didn't really matter very much which one you took. What does it matter if you took English literature or psychology? And second semester senior year, I took Sherry Turkle's class, Women in Computers, because I did still wonder how come there weren't more women in computer science. I kept hoping as I went through school that I'd meet more women like me. But at computer camp, I was the only girl in the top class, and I was the strongest girl at math at my high school. And I didn't make any, I don't think I made any female friends as an undergraduate at MIT. So I was interested in this question, and I started thinking about it a little because when I was a junior and started doing work at Technology Square, a graduate student I was acquainted with, Sharon Pearl, gave me the MIT Barriers to Equality report, which was the first thing that got me to see that women were treated differently and that their lesser success didn't mean lesser ability. But I took the course because I had to take another humanities course. And at the beginning, Sherry Turkle told us we'd have to write a 25-page term paper, and I asked, how are we going to do that? I've never written a paper that long. And I was very interested in the topic, and I found lots of things to read, and I solicited stories on the sisters' email list, which I may have joined in my junior year, and ended up writing 100 pages, which I revised and made into MIT AI Lab technical report, and that got way more attention than I expected and opened a lot of opportunities to me.
Yes, that's how you came to my attention first. I participated as giving input via sisters on that report.
I knew I worked with you after that. I didn't remember you were one of my informants.
Yes.
So I got a lot of useful information and feedback. I remember in a draft that I circulated, or maybe in some comments, I said I suggested that maybe women had it easier in admissions, or that if you had programs that favored women, that caused people to doubt their qualifications. And Nancy Leveson said, no, it's not easier for women to get things. The women have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. And Barbara Liskov said, well, it used to be harder for women than men to get into MIT, and we still weren't treated with respect. So I got a lot of useful feedback from senior women who took the time to do that.
Cool.
So senior year, I was also looking at graduate schools. There was no question in my mind that I'd go on. And I applied to Stanford, Berkeley, CMU, and MIT. I also applied for an NSF fellowship. And I got all of those. I got into all of the schools. It's kind of nice getting into Stanford for grad school, which I think is supposed to be more competitive when I didn't get in as an undergrad. And I got the NSF fellowship. And I visited all of the schools, in some cases staying with or talking with women I met through sisters. And I was favorably impressed by Carnegie Mellon on my visit. The students there seemed to be happy. I was not as impressed at Berkeley, that they had the first year computer science students in this basement with a bunch of terminals, and perhaps I shouldn't have given that much weight, but that gave me a negative impression. Stanford was very attractive. I met with Monica Lamb and John Hennessy and I think Anup Gupta. Does that sound right, Stanford? And I remember getting emotional when I was there, realizing that I might be leaving MIT and what I was used to, and that was a scary idea. I decided to stay at MIT, where I had a research group that I was part of, and where I enjoyed what I was working on and where my friends were. At most schools, they encourage their students to go elsewhere for graduate school, or they even require it. They don't accept their own students, but MIT isn't like that. That maybe a third of the incoming PhD class was MIT students. In any case, I stayed at MIT, and I continued working with Bill Daly for my master's thesis, which was also on compiling for the J machine, and I got some publications at stronger conferences, well, at top-tier conferences, and worked with a team at Berkeley at implementing their programming model, threaded abstract machine on the J machine, and evaluating that. I also, I guess it was after completing my master's degree, the semester after that I TA'd for the first, and only time, because I had the NSF fellowship and then research assistantships. I wasn't required, there was no push to teach, but I TA'd the scheme course, and I really enjoyed that. I was one of the TAs for Lynn Andrea Stein, young professor, so the lectures were done by Eric Grimson and Hal Abelson. Lynn did recitations, and as TA I attended those recitations, and I ran tutorial sections, 1-hour sessions for 3 students each at the start of the term, and by the end it was more like 2 students each, and I really enjoyed that. It was a lot of work, and I dropped one of the classes I was taking, but I enjoyed that.
So that was the primary teaching experience you had during your time at MIT then?
It was the primary experience. There wasn't a graduate compilers class, and I was still very interested in compilers, so I arranged for a graduate compiler seminar, which I led, and I worked with professors to come up with the reading list, and then different graduate students presented the papers, and we discussed them. But the only classroom teaching was 6001.
Okay. And so it sounds like there was a distinctness between the time you were working on your master's degree and then beginning to work on your PhD. But were they somehow related? Was the intention to go directly from master's into PhD from the beginning?
Yeah, at first I thought that I'd keep working with Bill Daly on the J machine, which is now in the Computer History Museum. And but I still had coursework that I was doing, and I went for the summer to work at Microsoft. I'd been an intern there several times as an undergraduate, but part of my reason for going out there was personal reasons, relationship with someone who was working, former MIT student who was working at Microsoft, and I decided that I wanted to continue to pursue that relationship and stay out in Seattle. And I spoke with my advisor, Bill Weil, who advised me to at least come back to MIT to finish my coursework before going in absentia. And surprisingly, I followed that sensible advice. I came back for a semester and finished my coursework. And then the plan was to do my thesis at Microsoft Research. And Bill reluctantly agreed to that. He didn't think that was the best idea, but he went along with it. And part of my justification was nobody was doing compilers at MIT, and I would be in a compiler research group at Microsoft. So I I had a thesis topic involving register allocation and instruction scheduling. And after a little over a year, I discovered that someone else had already done what I was doing. One of Mary Lou Sofa's students, I've since met Mary Lou several times, and that was devastating to me, that I'd have to start over with a new thesis topic. So MIT professors were very supportive. I remember talking with Jerry Sussman, who was trying to advise me on ways I could change the direction of the work I'd already done, maybe to operations research, to get a thesis out of it. And I wanted to stay out in Seattle, but Bill didn't think that, the failure indicated that you really need to work with people who know the area better. And he would have been happy to advise me at MIT, but he didn't want to advise me in absentia. I didn't really want to work on compilers anymore at that point, partly because of that bad experience, partly because I was growing fascinated with the internet, which was rising. This was about 1995. And I don't remember the exact sequence of how things happened, but Lynn Stein, whom I TA'd for, and who also had helped me make my report on women into an AI lab technical report. You need faculty approvers. She agreed to be my advisor, and I became a visiting scholar at University of Washington, working with Oren Etzioni. So I don't remember if he was an official or unofficial committee member, but I spent 2 years there doing my thesis in absentia, which was on internet information retrieval. That's where I met Keith Golden, who is my husband now. So, of course, at the time, having to start over with a new thesis topic seemed like the worst thing in the world, but I switched into an area I liked better. I met the love of my life. We've been married for more than 10 years now. So I came on the job market at the right time to get my dream job at Mills. So I try to be more philosophical about things that don't go as I expect, although it's always harder to at the time than in hindsight when you know that there was a good outcome.
What a path. Very interesting.
Well, I think most people's paths are twisty. Mine had just been straight for so long. Straight through, right. MIT, bachelor's, master's.
So it sounds like you had a wonderful support structure among the faculty that you encountered. Are there any particularly significant relationships, any particularly significant events during your entire time of working on your degrees that you'd like to share?
Well, the people I'd mentioned, Arvind, my undergraduate academic advisor, who was always encouraging and helpful to me. I remember he came to my undergraduate thesis presentation, and data flow was his model, but still, there was no reason he had to. It's nice of a professor to take an interest in an undergraduate's work. And Bill Daly, of course, hiring me as a undergraduate and then a graduate student, bringing me into his research group and spending his time and resources on me. Lynn Stein, who helped me out and was a very good advisor and was so modest that she didn't even like to put her name on her students' papers, even though that's standard practice. And she certainly contributed ideas. And Bill Weil, my graduate advisor, gave me good advice. He's at Google now. Bill Daly's at Stanford. Lynn, who spent time with her family, who had 3 children, which you just don't do before tenure, and took teaching very seriously, didn't get tenure and left MIT, and is now very happy at Owens, a new innovative institution. And I saw a lot of professors, junior faculty at MIT, be very stressed out trying to get tenure. And Lynn was never that way. And when she didn't get tenure, she didn't view it as the end of the world. Her idea with accepting a position at MIT was that that would be an interesting job and she'd do what she thought was valuable and she'd get tenure or not. But she wouldn't regret anything. And I certainly admire that attitude. But there were other faculty, junior faculty, who would be miserable and get divorced, and then still maybe they didn't get tenure. So seeing what people went through at MIT and who did and didn't get tenure, another wonderful person who didn't get tenure, Tom Knight, who was on my thesis committee, wonderful teacher, brilliant, generous with his time, not so good about reading documents when he's supposed to and getting them back, but and he didn't get tenure. And I was invited to give some talks because of my paper about women in computing, and one was at Smith College. Joe O'Rourke invited me there, and it was my first time seeing a liberal arts college, that the classes were small, that the students interacted with the faculty. I saw them chatting with Joe, and it was a women's college, and it was somewhere where teaching was really valued, and and people also did research, and that got me thinking that maybe a liberal arts college would be a better place to be a faculty member. Should I talk about my job search?
Yes, I think that's a perfect transition.
Okay. So I decided I wanted to be a professor or work at a research lab. And at this time, when I started my job search, Keith and I were close to being engaged and got engaged in December of that year. So it was a 2-body job search. And I applied to a lot of places because of that, and also because I didn't know what type of job I wanted, whether to be at a research university, a liberal arts college, or a research lab. Of course, if I could do things differently, I would have included internet startup, especially because my thesis was on internet information retrieval, but I didn't. And I applied to over 100 places. This was 97, so computer science departments were growing and professors were leaving for startups. Nowadays, you'd have trouble finding that many positions to apply for. And Keith applied to fewer places. He was interested in research labs, but there was AT&T Labs, Bell Labs, NASA, other labs or startups in the Bay Area, and actually no, he applied for some to research universities too. We both got interviews at University of Waterloo University in Canada. We may have both gotten invited to interview at University of Chicago. I got invited to interview at a lot of places, And one of my top places was Mills College, because it was a liberal arts college. It was a women's school. I wouldn't have to worry about, I felt I wouldn't have to worry about discrimination, or that if I had a child that I couldn't get tenure. The location, the Bay Area, there's a lot of computer science jobs. And I did get an offer from Mills. I wrote a lot of this up in a web page about doing a massive two-body job search. I got an offer from Mills. My biggest problem with them was convincing them that I was really serious. They thought that someone with a strong research record from MIT wouldn't want to be at a liberal arts college, that I was just using it as a backup position. So I really went out of my way to convince them that I was serious. And so when I got that offer, Keith hadn't yet started his Bay Area interviews. I think I got a 2-week deadline, which I extended to a 3rd week. And when Keith got a written offer from Intertrust and an oral offer from NASA, which was one of his top choices, I accepted the Mills offer, and Keith got and accepted an offer from NASA Ames at Moffett Field in Mountain View. So we couldn't have been happier about how our job search ended up. And he graduated first and moved to San Francisco and started working. And I then moved to San Francisco, started at Mills in January of '98.
Okay. And so you've talked a lot about the reasons you wanted to go to Mills. What was your course load like as you started, and were you able to continue with your research once you had arrived?
Those are good questions. The Mills teaching load was 2-3, and I didn't really think about what that would be like. My first semester I taught 2 courses, operating systems and digital logic and machine organization, and that semester was the hardest semester of my life, including being an undergraduate at MIT. Teaching was harder than I expected. MIT decided to stop using the lab kits that I'd used in the computer architecture class, and I got them to donate 20 of them to Mills. So I used those in my digital logic class. But both classes I was making up as I went along. I was also planning Keith and my wedding, which would be in June, and that was a large wedding with, I think we had about 175 people, but that was absolutely nothing compared to teaching. Planning 10 weddings wouldn't have been as much as one class. So that was challenging, but I knew I had a 3-year contract, a tenure track position. So how I did that semester I wasn't in danger of losing my job. I got some good advice from Judy Goldsmith. She said, your first year, your job is just to survive. If the students learn anything, that's great. That's a bonus. And the students were glad to see me. They'd had a bunch of adjuncts, and they were glad to have a tenure track teacher, even if they wouldn't be the ones to benefit. So I didn't do that good a job teaching at first. I hadn't taught classes, but my colleagues were encouraging. My second semester I co-taught with my colleague Steve Javant. He didn't get any teaching credit for that. He did that just to help me become a better teacher. My colleagues were committed to helping me and wanted me to succeed. and tried not to give me too many different classes so I could develop my classes. I looked all over for where I could get course releases from, and I got a course release for participating in a multicultural education seminar at Mills. And my first summer I applied for an NSF career grant, which I got, and that let me reduce my course load to 2.2, which was manageable, especially after I was teaching classes repeatedly. It was hard to do research, though. My first publications were ones based on my thesis, and the Mills program, we had undergraduates and we had a unique set of graduate programs aimed at people with bachelor's degrees in fields other than computer science. One program was a Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Computer Science. So someone would come in with, say, a degree in psychology, and they'd take computer science classes and do an interdisciplinary thesis and get a master's degree. We also had a re-entry program where people would also take computer science courses, but then apply to go to PhD programs in computer science. Sheila Humphreys and I wrote a paper about re-entry programs. She was heavily involved with the now defunct re-entry program at UC Berkeley that Barbara Simons and Paula Hawthorne, I think, started. Our program was started by Lenore Blum, who's now at Carnegie Mellon. So the students didn't have a background in computer science, and with the undergraduates, I was never able to successfully get them to contributing to research. The one time I tried training a group of them with funding from CRAW, by the time I trained them, they were all too busy with their other courses. And the graduate students, they really chose their thesis topics, which was fine, and did their own work. So I was basically on my own. I decided my original career proposal was to continue work based on my PhD, but I ended up not that motivated to do that, and instead helped design and implemented the new software for Sisters. So I did that with the Anita Borg Institute, now the Institute for Women in Technology, now the Anita Borg Institute, with Robin Jeffries and others. So I felt I was doing smaller science at this point. So that's what I worked on in my pre-tenure years at Mills. But I was very happy to be at Mills. At the research universities I interviewed at, I'd hear things like, don't spend any more time on teaching than you have to until after you get tenure. And I didn't think I'd be happy at somewhere like that, because I'd be seeing the students every day or several times a week. I wouldn't be happy if I wasn't doing a good job. Plus, the junior faculty worked so hard. I thought I might want to have children. I asked one college president, can a woman have children and still get tenure? He said, I don't see why not. It's just 3 months out of 6 years. So our joke is that if Keith had asked, he would have said it's just 15 minutes out of 6 years. So I was very happy to be somewhere that had the emphasis on teaching, that good teaching was absolutely essential, and I was given help to become a good teacher. that my work on women in computer science was viewed positively, not as something to make me suspect. And I liked the small classes, so I got to know students. I'd have them in multiple classes, so I could sometimes see the student develop over a period of years. When I was going to accept the Mills position, some MIT professors didn't understand that. When I'd first told Bill Daly I was thinking of applying to a liberal arts college, his response was, "Oh, Ellen, I'm sure you could get a job at a research university," but that wasn't the point, of course. And I tried to explain to him, and his oldest daughter went to a liberal arts college, so I like to think that eventually Bill got my point. I think he did. So it was a really nice environment. That my job was to help women develop as computer scientists, and I had a lot of freedom to develop the classes as I saw fit.
So can you talk about a typical teaching day for you?
Well, our class periods were 75 minutes, and we teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I never taught before 10:50 a.m. One of the things that Keith and I liked about our lives was we didn't need alarm clocks to wake up. We got to work late enough that we could wake naturally. And my teaching style was very interactive. At Mills, my classes were all under 20 students. Many were under 10. And I think I learned the teaching style from Lynn when I was her TA, that she wouldn't just lecture at the students, she'd also make up handouts that had problems for them to work on. And I would do that. I use PowerPoint slides, and I'd give students handouts with the slides printed on them, which they appreciated, and I'd print onto transparencies so I could draw on them. Also, at first, we didn't have data projection, but I would present material, maybe work an example, and then have an example for us to work together or for students to work on themselves or with people next to them. The students were always free to interrupt and ask questions. I use a lot of humor in my talk, funny analogies or nerdy jokes. I had some policies to encourage participation. Sometimes I'd go around the room and call on people in turn. But I also told students at the beginning of class, at the beginning of the semester, that they could say pass if they're having a rough day, and I'll pass and leave them alone, but to try to get everybody to participate. I also had a prize bag, so when I'd get free things at conferences, I'd put them in this bag, and if a student answered and gave a really good answer to a question, or if they asked a really good question, I'd let them draw something from the prize bag, and the students liked that, and that was fun. So I'd say one of the major characteristics of my teaching is great enthusiasm, and something I also learned from my students was to always give them the big picture and not just have a bunch of details where they didn't know how that fit in. So in the computer architecture class, at the beginning I'd tell them that they learn all the way down how computers work, that there's almost everybody uses computers, some people program them, but very few people know how they work all the way down to the transistor level. And then my students would be part of that select bunch, that they would build a computer and know all the way down how it worked. And that if they went back in time 100 years, they'd be able to build the first modern computers with what they knew. And these students didn't have high self-confidence. I think a lot of them probably didn't believe me that they would understand this, but by the end of the semester they did. And this class we used Hennessy and Patterson's computer organization and design, and also these MIT lab kits. And I created a semester-long lab, which started with their designing and building adders, and ended by their building a computer where they burned the program onto a PROM and plugged the PROM into the computer, and it would run a stored program. And they'd debug it with a logic probe and looking at lights and understand it, just as I said, all the way down. And on earlier labs, before we got to the stored program, they programmed it with switches and pulses. So I found the course very exciting and communicated that enthusiasm to students. And at the end of the semester, when each student got her lab project working, I'd take a picture of her with it, and I'd give the students the pictures. It was something we were all excited about. And in other classes, in compilers, I talk about how compiler writers are unsung heroes, that the students did a little assembly language in their computer architecture course, and they know how hard it is, and that people wouldn't be able to build really big programs without compiler writers. And also without them, that we'd be programming an assembly language like animals. So I didn't mind if I appeared, corny or nerdy. And in course evaluations, I'd always score high for instructors' enthusiasm, also instructors' knowledge of the material, generating student interest. Wouldn't always be so high in organization, although I got much better at that when I repeated material.
So you've touched a little bit on what I suspect is your teaching philosophy, but can you sum up your teaching philosophy in a few sentences?
Well, my teaching philosophy, I consider motivation key, that I want the students to think that what they're doing is exciting, that they're learning something wonderful or something that they can change the world with, and that everything I teach, all the material I include, I should be able to justify how it's contributing to that goal that they're excited about. I'm not going to teach something just because there's a chapter of it in the book, but in computer architecture, does it contribute to their goal of understanding computers all the way down? That's the first part of the course. Later on, I talk about improving computer performance. But I'm also saying now we're going to look at pipelining, and the purpose of pipelining is because once people have a computer, they want it to go faster, and this contributes to that goal. And all the people who jumped into their time machine after the first part to go invent the first computers, you can go back and build faster ones once you learn this material. Sorry, not a few sentences. So motivation is part of it. Another is learning by doing. So in these 75-minute class sessions, you have students be active by answering questions, asking questions, working problems. And then when you send them home, carefully choosing assignments so they're not busy work, but so they're really learning how to apply the concepts. And also, but with our interdisciplinary computer science program, we get students who feel like they're remedial in computer science because their undergraduate degree is in something else, and they're a little apologetic. And I tell them not to be, that computer scientists are a dime a dozen, but someone who is their background in another field, so someone who was a teacher or a nurse before, or a political scientist, that if you take that knowledge and add the computer science that they've been learning at Mills, you get a unique combination, and with their thesis, they can do something that someone who is just trained as a political scientist couldn't do, someone who was just trained as a computer scientist couldn't do. Me with my MIT PhD, I couldn't do it, but because of their unique skills, that they can do something that nobody else in the world can. So communicating that to the students.
Very good. Is there a particular story you'd like to tell about any of your courses or students?
I can't think of any. I'm proud of many of them, first-generation college students who get high-paying and satisfying jobs, or someone who was discouraged from taking computer science, from taking science classes in college because she was a woman, discovering that she's really good at it and going on to a successful career or getting a PhD. It's all great.
Yes.
And I should say I also had male students, that the graduate programs were co-ed.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Right, so that's federal law, although Mills did that even before it was federal law. But yeah, there were some wonderful male students, so I had co-ed classrooms, and of course I'd make sure that no student dominated the conversation.
Okay. So your career, we talked a little bit about pre-tenure. You've passed the magic 3-year mark, so maybe we can talk a little about tenure and then also the transition to what you're doing right now with Google as part of your career path.
Okay. I started mid-year, so I wrote into my contract that I had the choice whether to go up in my 5th year or 6th year, after 5.5 years or 6.5 years, and I chose to go up earlier, and I got tenure and promoted to associate professor. And then it was time where I could take a sabbatical, and I spent 2004 at Google. I mentioned my thesis was on internet information retrieval, and some of what I did was the same as what Google was doing, specifically looking at the link structure and using that to recommend pages. And I had been acquainted with the Google founders when I was a grad student. We'd present at the same conferences and we cited each other's papers. So I'd watched Google with interest. And so, plus I knew it was a wonderful place to work. And Peter Norvig, who I was acquainted with and was head of search at Google then and is now director of research, was willing to be my host. And I spent 2004 working at Google. Most professors who spend a sabbatical or leave at Google don't go back to teaching. They stay at Google. But as much as I enjoyed that, I also really enjoyed teaching. So I returned to Mills after that, but I was able to arrange to work at Google 1 day a week and during summers. So it sounded to people like I had an extra hard work life, working full-time at Mills plus this job at Google. I was 40% at Google, but I was really double dipping because professors are supposed to spend 1 day a week in the summer doing research. So I was doing what I was supposed to do at Mills anyway, but I was also not just getting paid by Google, but getting Google resources. I could do my research on Google's machines and infrastructure, and also my evaluation with the millions of clicks that Google gets if I wanted to test something. And we published, I guess it was just a poster, short paper poster at KDD, Knowledge Discovery and Data Mining, based on some work I did at Google. So that was really the best of both worlds, being able to teach, being a professor, and having tenure while also being able to work in industry at the best company.
And so you're currently in the midst of a period where you're not teaching and you're working at Google, correct?
Right. What happened was that I became department head at Mills. That's a 2-year term, and the first 3 semesters were fine. But the 4th semester, the administration decided to close our graduate program. We had low enrollment. Computer science enrollment was down then, and the program was always pretty small. And I knew there was the risk of its being closed. I'd been trying everything I could think of for years to increase the enrollment with very little help from other people. I was bearing the total weight, but I wasn't prepared for the administration announcing that they were closing the program, particularly because that's the faculty's right. Only the faculty can. So the administration said the program's being closed, and we said, you can't do that, and they didn't listen to us, so we went to the Faculty Executive Committee, which is our representatives from the faculty, and had meetings with them, and they wrote a memo telling the administration, you can't do that, the faculty has to vote on this. The administration said, okay, we're not closing the program, but we're not letting you admit any students. So we went through the executive committee again, saying that, no, this is tantamount to closing a program, you can't do that. And finally the administration said, okay, we'll let you admit students. But then I hear from a student who we recommended for admission that she hasn't been admitted. So then we go to the president, and she says, well, if the provost said that students would be admitted, then they have to do that, although the president thought it would be fine to suspend admission. So we got those students in, but going through all this was so stressful on me. This affected my physical and mental health. I had to go on anti-anxiety medicine for the first time in my life. I was stuttering, and decided I should take a leave from Mills, that I had this other wonderful place I could work, and Mills wasn't a healthy place for me, and maybe after the leave there'd be a change in administration or enrollments would go back up. Unfortunately, the next year, I went on leave at Google, so became a full-time employee. Unfortunately, too late to get stock options worth anything. But at this point, Keith had joined Google. NASIG, too, had gone downhill, and he joined Google. So I began working as a research scientist full-time at Google. It was nice being able to commute with my husband. Unfortunately, things did not get better at Mills. The next year, they decided to pull the funding from our students who were halfway through the program, which was against prior tradition at Mills. And I decided to take a second year of leave. And now I'm in October of my second academic year. Planning has started for next year, and my department head wants to know whether I'll be back. And I just haven't decided because it's not a good environment for computer science. I really miss teaching, and even though Google is such a wonderful workplace and I've been given a lot of freedom, I really think I'd like to go back to being a professor, but I don't know if I should go back to Mills or find another position. I've applied for a few other faculty positions, and am really thinking about would I be willing to give up tenure at Mills without getting tenure somewhere else. And would I be willing to leave the Bay Area, where Keith and I have lived for 11 years, have a beautiful house, and have built up our life. So I expect to have some tough decisions in the next year.
Good luck as you face all of that.
Thank you. I'll try to, maybe it'll be like with my thesis, where it'll all turn out better because of something going differently from how I planned. Mm-hmm. But it's always harder when you're in the midst of it. But I had thought that once you get tenure, you live happily ever after, or that if something is your dream job, it stays your dream job. But it changed. When I got there, it was during the boom. We had more students and more support from the administration. And now we don't have the students, and we lost the support. Although there's a new provost who seems wonderful, but it may be too late for me. I'm not sure.
I'm going to move us ahead. Our window of opportunity is closing a little bit. So what I'd like to find out is about your outside interests, if you have any strong outside interests that would help us understand you better.
Well, there's certainly my interest in women in computing, and I've continued to write about that and participate on panels and be involved at a light level with education of girls, such as leading electronics workshops at the annual Expanding Your Horizons conference at Mills. And I supervise 3 master's theses on computer science education. I wouldn't say I have that many outside interests. I'm a doting aunt. I have 9 nieces and nephews whom I adore, though none of them live nearby. So I've been doing volunteer work with children. But my husband and I lead quiet lives. On the weekend, we take it easy, take advantage of being in San Francisco and go on walks and go out for brunch. I read. All of us are following the election going on now, both the presidential election, and there are some important ballot initiatives in California. I have been involved with nonprofits. I've been on the board of 2, and I'm planning to join a 3rd. I was on the board of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility and an advocacy group, Stop Prisoner Rape. I was also their webmaster, got their material online, and we were a co-plaintiff in ACLU versus Reno, the internet censorship case. We were part of the argument that there's material that's indecent but has educational value and should be able to be online, and the ACLU won that case. And I've continued to have an interest in prisoners, how they're treated, and I think in general I have an interest in the underdog, whether it's women in computer science or whether it's low-income children or prisoners. And I've been involved in the group Prison Legal News for a long time and may be joining their board once they get proper liability insurance, and help them get online too. So I'd say I'm someone who cares a lot about fairness. That's why it was so upsetting to me how things went at Mills, that if the faculty had voted to close the program, that would have been bad. But for the administration to close it in violation of the handbook, that's very different to me.
Very unfair.
Yeah, and fairness matters a lot to me.
Yeah. If you could give advice to a young person just starting out, what would it be?
Well, I'd say to decide what's important to you in a career So I decided to go to Mills, even though there were some MIT faculty who thought I was wasting my opportunities, that I could have gone to a research university, but their ideal of a career wasn't the same as mine. So I gave a lot of thought to what I'd want in a job to be happy, and I wanted a job that would reward me for the things that I thought were most important, such as doing a very good job teaching or working to increase women in computer science, and at a workplace that wouldn't penalize me for things such as having a child, which I didn't do.
All right, so we're down to the end of it. Is there any story that you'd like to share that you haven't gotten to share that we can close with here?
No, I think that last thing I said, plus about what happened with my thesis and it's turning out for the best, are my stories.
Excellent.
And then, of course, there's the story about my current career choices, but I don't know the end to that yet.
Okay. Well, I thank you so much. I know we could continue for a while, and I hope that we'll have the chance again in the future.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you, Ellen.